Waging total war. In the first 2 years of the war, little went well for the Union. President Lincoln's generals failed him one after another. Still, a Union victory in 1862 made it possible for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which granted freedom to slaves in the Confederacy. Freeing all the slaves, along with saving the Union, had become Lincoln's main goals for the war. Although the North felt its cause was just, Union losses were horrible. In one battle, a Union survivor recalled that men fell like leaves in autumn. It seems miraculous that any of us escaped at all. The cries of the wounded, another man said, were weird, unearthly, terrible to hear and bear. We'll come back and read these nonfiction text features at the end. As the war dragged on, Northern feeling against the fighting grew. Unlike Republicans, Democrats called for an end to battle and a negotiated end to the war. The 1864 election would determine the whole direction of the war, and Lincoln believed he would lose. Instead, Lincoln won. Re-election gave him the strength to continue the war in order to reunite the country and end slavery. In January 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, in addition to the Constitution that ended slavery in the United States. Lincoln also finally had the generals he needed, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. These two commanders waged brutal war on the Confederacy in hopes of ending the war as swiftly as possible. Sherman's campaign took him through the Deep South. In late 1864, after burning much of Atlanta, his men marched across the state of Georgia. They tore up rail lines, destroyed bridges, and set fire to many homes. In January 1865, Sherman's army turned northward into South Carolina. Emma LeConte, a 17-year-old girl in Columbia, South Carolina, described the nighttime burning of the city by Sherman's troops. They would enter houses, and in the presence of helpless women and children, pour turpentine on the beds and set them on fire. The wretched people rushing from their homes were not allowed to keep even the few necessities they gathered up in their flight. Throughout the burning city, LeConte recalled, a quivering molten ocean seemed to fill the air and sky. Meanwhile, to the north, Grant had been waging a grim and steady campaign against Lee. One horrible battle took place in mid-1864 at Cold Harbor, Virginia. Grant ordered an attack on Confederate lines that caused some 7,000 Union casualties in 20 minutes. One soldier later said, "This wasn't war, but murder." Such bloodshed earned Grant the nickname the Butcher. Still, Grant was wearing down Lee's army, and by early 1865, he had Lee stopped in trenches outside of Petersburg, Virginia. The South surrenders. Before dawn on April 3rd, Lee fled Petersburg. He knew that staying there any longer would doom his army, but Union forces doggedly pursued Lee's retreat. Grant was determined that Lee would not escape. On April 6th, Grant's army killed or wounded about 8,000 Confederate soldiers. Lee saw that surrender was the only reasonable option. After 4 bloody years, the Civil War was coming to an end. Grant offered generous terms for the South surrendered. He allowed all Confederate soldiers to return home. He also agreed that Lee's troops could keep their horses and mules. Because Lee's men were nearly starving, Grant ordered food for thousands. Other Confederate forces in the South had not yet given up the fight, but they all soon surrendered. On April 2nd, Confederate President Jefferson Davis fled the Confederate capital, Richmond. On May 10th, he was captured and would spend 2 years in prison. The Civil War was over. The human costs of the war. The Civil War was the deadliest war in U.S. history. At least 620,000 Americans, both Union and Confederate, died in the 4-year conflict. The numbers of casualties, those killed, wounded, or missing, in some battles were staggering. The casualties in the one-day Battle of Antietam, Maryland, in 1862 totaled nearly 23,000. To date, it remains the single bloodiest day in U.S. history. And you can go ahead and finish reading the nonfiction text